Welcome to the M&A Unplugged podcast. Our mission is to help you be better prepared for your business acquisition or sale. Being prepared will ensure you maximize returns and minimize risks. This is M&A Unplugged with your host, Dominic Rinaldi.
Hey, M&A Unplugged community. This is your host, Dominic Rinaldi. In today's episode, I talk with Josh Freemire of the Epstein, Becker & Green law firm about regulatory issues, valuations, and other considerations related to private practice mergers and acquisitions. Josh is a healthcare regulatory attorney that spends much of his time advising buyers and sellers of healthcare companies. The M&A environment for professional practices is forecasted to pick up steam as more and more providers decide to cash in their chips. But given the challenges around COVID, these M&A transactions will be much harder to navigate. You will definitely need an experienced attorney on your transaction like Josh, who is up to speed on the latest regulatory, compliance, and risk issues. Before we get into the interview, please head over to K2 Advisor and take our free seller or buyer assessment. These assessments will help you understand how ready you really are for an acquisition or sale. The buyer readiness assessment is at the bottom of the Acquire tab, and the seller readiness assessment is at the bottom of the Exit tab. Understanding how prepared you are for an acquisition or sale is imperative to ensuring that you maximize returns and minimize risks. Thank you for being here, and hope you enjoy my conversation with Josh. Hey, Josh, thanks for being here today with the M&A Unplugged community. So nice to have you.
Glad to be here. My pleasure.
So Josh, maybe just quickly for the audience, if you could give them a quick backgrounder on yourself, a little more texture to your background and your bio would be great.
Sure. I've been a healthcare regulatory side healthcare attorney since I left law school. So that's about 15 or 16 years now. I started out at a firm in Baltimore that focused exclusively on representing providers. When you talk about healthcare law and regulatory law, it's usually divided or used to be divided between providers and insurance companies. So I worked with providers, so hospitals, doctors, labs, long-term care facilities, pretty much every kind of provider side business that you can think of. And I did every facet of regulatory work while I was there that you can think of, from reimbursement, fraud and abuse, which is the Stark and anti-kickback law compliance, state licensing, reimbursement work, and healthcare privacy work. I actually worked with some of the largest healthcare companies in the country around their rollout for EHR systems when they first started doing incentive programs for that. Came to Epstein, Becker & Green 6 years ago now, a little longer, and have focused my practice here more on the investor side. So I still represent a lot of providers, and I represent providers especially who are looking to sell into larger sponsor-backed entities. So I do that frequently. But I also represent a lot of sponsors and other investors in terms of either building platforms or doing small add-ons to existing platforms.
Yeah, that's great. So you've been in and around this environment a long time. Healthcare is a healthy sector when it comes to M&A. We've got a number of deals right now in the healthcare sector. It's remained very strong, but there's some real challenges, right? I mean, COVID is presenting some very interesting challenges for the healthcare business in general. What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Well, certainly a lot of the work I've done has been with PPMs, right? So we call them physician practice management companies, but really that extends out and covers a broader spectrum than just physicians, right? It also includes physical therapists and optometrists and veterinarians and dentists. So all of those have been very popular areas for acquisition. All of those are consumer-facing businesses. And as a result, they ran into just a brick wall with the shutdowns around COVID. The comeback from that has been, I think, a little stronger than some people feared, but it definitely hasn't been a V-shaped curve that folks were necessarily hoping for, both because of virus resurgence that we're seeing across the Southwest right now and the South, but also just because people are a little timid to go back for a dental cleaning, for instance, when they don't have to. Regulatory oversight also has changed around those businesses a little bit. Again, dental is a great example. It requires a fair amount of elbow grease, right? You have a mouth open, there's spray, there's water droplets that become aerosolized, especially in a COVID environment. People are very concerned about that. So you've seen state boards in a lot of these spaces, dental, optometry, others step in terms of changing regulations around how you can practice, how you can see patients, what equipment, what PPE is necessary, and how they expect businesses to go about the reopening process. So that's played a role as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting you bring up dental. I was at the dentist's office this morning for an annual cleaning or biannual
You're a
cleaning.
brave man.
And I've been putting it off for 6 months. So I was supposed to go a while back and I put it off, and then they kept on calling me and I'm like, no, I'm not ready to come back. And, they finally convinced me that all the safety measures that were in place, and, I have to say the way they handled it was perfectly. They're only letting people in when your appointment is there. They ask you to stay in the car. They bring you back to your room, and then, you go out a separate entrance, and all the safety measures while you're there are certainly in place. But that said, it's still, like you said, there's exposure, right? And so you have to be very careful. How are buyers in the marketplace looking at this? Like, obviously, revenues, fell off the cliff for a lot of these practices, right? And so now they're coming back, and I even talked to my dentist about it, which he runs a pretty large practice, multiple doctors. They've got a lot of technicians. His business has come back, not back to where it was, but it's come back. But for a while there, he was essentially shut down. He's not looking to sell, but, for companies like that are looking to sell, how are the buyers looking at that, knowing that, it's fallen off the cliff? You're not quite certain what recovery is going to look like. What are they thinking?
Well, I think a lot of them right now are expecting to see discounts in asking prices, and they're not quite yet. I can tell you from conversations just kind of in the market with a lot of different sponsors, there's a lot of interest, especially from smaller organizations looking to kind of take shelter in a larger platform. Maybe now's the time to finally go part-time or to retire or to sort of let someone else take over the business concerns around the practice. But there's pretty serious issues around trying to figure what's the business worth, right, given the changes in how the marketplace is going to function and the uncertainty around the time frame for that. But also, how has compliance changed? So especially, we'll just use dental again as an example, right? So I know there are several states that have required sort of additional equipment or thinking about requiring significant additional equipment for dental offices, including ventilation equipment, different kinds of shields and PPE. So if a practice didn't have any of those things and now it's looking to reopen, it is at the same time looking to join a larger platform. That one of the questions is going to be, well, are you really worth the same as you were a year ago or 2 years ago? But even if we say that you are, what are the changes? How are they going to impact cash flow over the next year or two, right? So it's slower patient demand, but also all the additional expenses required with compliance and sort of modernizing practice and facility that may not be in that spot right
now. Yeah. So compliance, let's talk a little bit about that. What do you think these individual practices are going to be faced with? We're going to have federal involvement. We're going to have state involvement. What does that look like? And are any of them coordinating their efforts at the moment? Are there state and federal discussions that are happening so that there's a standard across the board and across the country, or how do you think this rolls out at the end of the day? And I know we're trying to paint a broad brush across many disciplines, but let's do the best we can.
Yeah, and we can think about it really kind of split up into two sections, right? So one of those is going to be federal fraud and abuse laws, which is like the Stark, the kickback statute, and compliance with federal programs like the Paycheck Protection Act, loans and grants. So those are going to be uniform across the country. I will say that there has not been a ton of enforcement effort around those. In fact, the OIG and CMS collaboratively waived some of the requirements around Stark earlier in the pandemic to allow for sort of ease of operations for healthcare entities. Those waivers are mostly expired at this point. I think we're going to see more of an enforcement focus from the federal government, especially as the pain of all these expenditures kind of comes home to roost over the next year or two. The OIG and the DOJ both kind of see part of their mission as recouping ill-gotten gains regarding healthcare. So I think we'll see more aggressive enforcement from federal authorities. At the state level, and states are going to vary very widely, both based on how the virus affected them, but also based on the industry you're talking about. So whether you're talking eye care or dental or gastro or what, your state licensing board is also going to be interested in compliance activities, both because of any state programs that you participated in, and some states have their own incentive or loan programs out there for folks, but also compliance with ongoing regulatory requirements around changes to the business because of COVID. So PPE again, or equipment, or operational necessities around separate exits and entrances, and social distancing, and those issues.
Yeah.
So all that's going to matter, and buyers are certainly going to need to look at that very closely.
Yeah. And so it stands to reason that with all this additional expense, these practices are probably going to be looking to increase their rates or change their models in some way. The consumer is going to wind up probably having more out of pocket, I would imagine, because the insurance companies are probably not going to change their rates of reimbursement, right?
It's an interesting question. I will tell you, I've heard a lot of talk from larger entities talking about the sort of fundamental unfairness of a system where lots of folks are paying for insurance, no one can use that insurance. At the same time that all these practices across the healthcare spectrum were financially devastated, a lot of insurance companies received a windfall because during that same period, no one made any claims, right? Or very, very few claims. So there is a fair amount of talk, and I don't know whether it's ultimately going to express itself in a legislative effort or just individual kind of larger entities renegotiating their rates with payers or renegotiating their payment structure, right? There certainly has been a lot of interest in moving towards risk-bearing and capitated rates, because practices that were in that kind of environment where they were paid a per person per month rate, they really didn't see an impact from this, right? They continued to be paid the same amount. Yeah. So that rate structure and the capitation and risk-taking side becoming a lot more attractive, especially to physician practices.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, whether it's a physician practice management group or any other acquirer in the market who's looking to, make an acquisition of individual practices or small groups. What sort of diligence and things do they need to be thinking about now in this COVID environment that maybe they weren't thinking about before?
Well, certainly compliance with the various loan and grant programs that are out there is going to be a hot button issue. I think more than ever, a lot of, I'll take for instance, the compliance with the anti-kickback statute, right? Relationships with referral sources is a common thing that you look at in almost any healthcare business. Compliance around that is going to be a little more fraught because it is almost always a risk assessment. Relationships typically don't fit within safe harbors that are available. So there always is a bit of a facts and circumstances analysis to determine how much risk do we think this has. I think the risks are going to be elevated in an environment where the government is actively looking to recoup a lot of lost money, right? So that's a significant consideration. For sellers in this market, I think there's been a trend over the past 3 to 5 years. These structures have been very, very popular. What that has unfortunately invited is a lot of folks getting into them that maybe aren't the best suited to operate a physician practice management company. They weren't necessarily the best partner. They didn't understand the ins and outs of a healthcare business the way they might need to. So you've seen some of those larger platforms struggle. I think that's going to continue. So for sellers, a big consideration is not just getting the best bang for your buck. It's going to be, who am I partnering with? Like, what is their secret sauce for growing this company over the next year, 3 years, 5 years? What is my stock going to be worth 3 years down the road? And do I feel confident that these guys really understand either the optometry business or the veterinary business, the dental business, or the orthotics business to really sort of drive this organization to the next level?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good warning for sellers, because especially in this environment, in this COVID environment, we already talked about it at the top of the show, that valuations are going to be really hard to nail down, right? And
Right.
so either the valuations are going to be compressed, or if an owner wants to hold value, they're probably going to wind up having to take some good percentage in an earnout. And if you're taking an earnout payment, now you're putting the future of the practice in the hands of this PPM or this other buyer group. You better be confident that it's in good hands, that they're going to be good stewards of the business, that they're going to be able to grow it. Otherwise, your earnouts, you're never going to see it.
Well, and think too about the leverage that the business either already has or that it's planning for the future. I mean, a lot of the PPM entities are either pretty highly levered or even over levered. So you may be in a situation where, yeah, you're receiving an earnout promise, or you're receiving stock or phantom stock in the entity, but it may never be able to get to the point that it can pay that, because it's already got a bunch of loans that were predicated on 120% of the revenue it did 2 years ago. And, and we're looking at 60% of that, or 75.
Right, right. What about from a buyer's perspective, if you're doing diligence here, the obvious risks that your workforce is at risk every day,
Right.
and your patients are at risk. And how do you think buyers are going to look at that? One, from a risk perspective, but two, from a valuation perspective and a deal making perspective.
I mean, concerns about liability for COVID, I think, have been talked about a lot. It's obviously an unknown at this point, right? We haven't seen the kind of late night infomercials about call us now if you've been exposed, or someone in your family, right? I think we may eventually get to that point.
Yeah.
I think we certainly are seeing a very strong public outcry for sort of more social distancing requirements, more in the way of mask requirements, at least online, which is not always the best representative of the world at large. People would really like to be done with this. So I think they're going to be more aggressive about businesses that haven't been great about maintaining those things.
So if I'm a buyer today, and you're right, the movie hasn't played out, right? But if I'm a
Right.
buyer today, what steps am I taking proactively to make sure that I'm not assuming too much risk here, or unnecessary risk? You've got your typical reps and warranties and indemnifications, but is there something else, or is there an expanded scope that people need to be thinking about to protect themselves?
Well, I think it's really around what kind of protections does the business have in place, not just the one you're buying, but the one you're operating, right? And there really aren't guidelines in most states on exactly how to do that. So there is going to be a little research involved in talking to trade organizations, talking to state licensing boards, working with practitioners. And again, it's really important there that your sponsors have a good relationship with the actual practitioners, right? And they can talk about these issues in a knowledgeable way with them and help drive the right decisions for the business as a whole, whether that be changes in operational considerations, changes to physical plant, changes in PPE. All of those things are going to matter. So you kind of have to look to what authority is out there and think about ways that you can at least meet or even exceed expectations in terms of patient and employee safety.
Well, and as you're providing that guidance and perspective, I'm thinking, this seems to be quicksand at the moment, right? It's a shifting sands. We don't know where this is going to settle. it'd probably be good to have this conversation in 6 months from now to see
Yeah.
what's changed between this conversation and then, because it's going to be imperfect, and it's going to take a lot of thinking around how you protect yourself, both if you're practicing and if you're looking to buy into a practice.
Well, as I've said to a lot of my clients, chaos is always just opportunity and an ugly party mask, right?
Mm,
So it's a mess right now. But if you looked at it 8, 10 months ago, the complaints I was getting around practices, all PPM businesses, were people are demanding way too much money. It's really hard to turn a profit given what we're paying the docs, right? Well, now you have a situation where the docs are desperate to be bought in a lot of circumstances. So there's an opportunity here to grow a business that maybe 8 months ago you weren't able to get your foot in the door in this or that market, but in this circumstance you can. And for docs that were out there looking for an exit, this is a great opportunity to kind of back off and let someone else deal with the headaches. So I still think the fundamental factors around healthcare and the markets, there's a lot of dry powder in the industry. Healthcare is kind of an eternal sea, right? They're always going to be churning in there. The need is high. There's a great opportunity for people to jump in.
yeah, I think that's a great point because, as you point to, the capital markets are still wide open, interest rates are still very low, and you probably have a very high percentage of practices who are owned and operated by baby boomers who are going to be looking to get out, right?
That's right.
So the exit exists. It may not be as rosy as it was maybe 6 months or a year ago, but the exit opportunities are still going to be there. But both parties, as I think you're pointing out, are really going to go into it, need to go into it eyes wide open, because there's much more risk all the way around.
Yeah, that's right. It's a more of a shifting sands environment, certainly.
Yeah, yeah. Josh, anything else from a compliance regulatory perspective that you think buyers and sellers need to be thinking about?
Well, I mean, one really interesting area that I think both should be considering is telemedicine and remote operations,
Mm,
right? One of the things that COVID has certainly driven home to every kind of business, including yours and mine, is no, you really can do this from home, right? Everyone argued about that for a while, but now you can. So telemedicine was a bit of a struggle for a lot of years. There are much more activity now at the state board level, and not just for actual, for physician visits. You also see it for optometry, for dentistry in certain circumstances, for a lot of different kind of healthcare fields. Telemedicine is a new frontier. Uh, Folks who are the first to develop the technology that will allow for remote visits that produce the same or better outcome as inpatient face-to-face encounters, they're going to have a great business model. And again, you're seeing a lot of pressure on payers and officials to not just permit, but promote those kind of business models.
What are the current regulations today as it relates to telemedicine? Are they there? Do they have a ways to go? What's the state of the state as far as telemedicine goes?
It's state by state.
Is it?
Yeah, it really is. And part of that is because the state licensure for professionals is a state by state issue.
Right.
Telemedicine is going to fall under those licensure rules for the most part. So whether or not you're paid by Medicare is obviously a federal consideration, or how much you're paid. But even Medicaid is going to be on a state by state basis. And then what you can do, what are the protocols, what licenses are required, very much on a state to state basis.
Mm,
Some states, Florida jumps to mind, they've aggressively embraced telemedicine. They have a whole setup there that not only permits it, but has a state registration structure in place. They very much are looking to the future. Other states, and I won't use any names to disparage them, have been very aggressive about it, right? The worst kind of protective instincts from state licensing boards that you can imagine, where they say, no, you have to physically come to the state. You have to physically get a license in the state. You can only see patients in the state.
yeah.
So it's all over the map. But a lot of companies out there are fighting to standardize it, and they're getting a lot of success right now.
Do you think that this is the new frontier for businesses, that this brings the technology component really into delivering medicine, and people that embrace this are going to be the winners in the long run here?
I'm talking to you right now through a magical video window that's on a tiny little box that has all the information in the world in it that I carry in my pocket.
Yeah.
There's no question in my mind that within the next 10 years, I am not going to have to go to see my doctor to get
Yeah.
the vast majority of prescriptions, and
Yeah.
doctors are going to be well compensated for that.
Yeah.
So
So
necessity
truth
is
be
the
told,
mother of
my
invention.
wife is a physician assistant, and she has been for nearly 15 years. And there was a period, obviously, where she was doing just telemedicine because they weren't taking people in the office. Uh, she said, outside of helping some patients get over the technology hurdles, she found it to be incredibly efficient. You still have to see some patients. She said, there's no doubt some people need to be seen, but for so many things, this is a great medium for that. And she found it to
There's no
be
question.
very productive.
And especially when you think about, one of the things that I think we're going to see from COVID generally is kind of a diaspora to more suburban and rural locations out of densely packed urban centers.
Yeah.
That's already happened a little bit. And rural healthcare is already a big concern because this is very difficult to have the expertise of someone who does, 10,000 knee replacements in the past couple of years in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, right?
Yeah.
So if you can telemedicine those kind of people in, it opens up a lot more of the country to really high quality medical care. It makes it much more accessible.
Am I right, though, in saying that the insurance companies don't view telemedicine the same way they view an in-person, in-office visit, and that the reimbursement levels are nowhere near what you would be if you saw a physician or any other doctor in
It's
person?
something, it's something that's going to have to change. Now, excuse me, there's a little bit of change because of volume, right? You're going to be able to see a little bit more volume telemedicine wise. But certainly from my clients that I spoke with that dove into telemedicine in traditional healthcare, traditional physician practice spaces, they did not see a revenue replacement, right? They saw revenue replacement of 60%, 70%, but nowhere near 100%. The reimbursement rates are much lower, but again, that's something that's currently being fought about. And we talked a little bit about earlier, the insurance companies, I think, are going to have to meet people halfway in
Does
terms
that
of
have to
coming up with a
happen
solution.
first? Does that have to happen first before you see a real embracing of telemedicine by practices?
I mean, I think you're going to see a real embracing of it over the next year or so,
Anyway.
no matter what, right? Because I think the opportunity to recoup 70% of revenue that is otherwise lost, the opportunity, even if you want to leave aside the business considerations, just from an actual practitioner doctor-patient relationship point of view, the ability to check in with that patient who has advanced COPD, advanced heart disease or heart failure, you want to touch base with them, you want to see them.
Yeah.
And say, how are you feeling? Are you keeping up on your medication? So there's been a lot of work over the years on solutions for that,
Yeah.
but now it's necessitated.
So it's
So
going
I
to be
think you'll see
interesting to
it.
see what happens to valuations of practices then, as telemedicine becomes, a bigger piece of what everybody's doing. Do valuations go down, or do they go up because you're able to reduce your footprint, increase your margins, and does that become look? And that is not the most important question, right? The more important question is,
Right.
can we deliver good services to people who need it, right? So I don't mean to diminish that at all, but this is a
It
show
all plays a
about
role.
M&A, and sellers worry about valuations and buyers worry about buying solid practices. And so with that disclaimer, in there that, the delivery of medical services is the most important thing, I wonder how this is going to impact valuations long term.
I agree with you, and it'll be interesting to see as the technology develops, right? Who ultimately sort of controls the content there and the way that it works. I think just like a while ago, you saw a lot of physician practices did a lot of medical device work.
Yeah.
So docs became multimillionaires because they patented the next best knee or the next best shoulder. I think you'll see a similar scenario around telemedicine and the ability to remotely control equipment. the ability to better preserve video records. There's lots of aspects of the technology that can be improved.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see that going forward.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Josh, this has been a tremendous conversation. I really enjoyed this. Your parting comments, anything that you would leave the M&A Unplugged community with as it relates to this?
I mean, I find healthcare to be a fascinating, exciting frontier. That certainly hasn't changed in COVID. I wake up every day and learn new things, and I'm more excited about the future than I was the day before. So if you're not already into healthcare as an investor, I encourage you to take a look at it. And if you're a seller, I encourage you to talk to your friendly neighborhood regulatory attorney, because you'd be amazed at what you don't know.
Yeah, I believe that. If people wanted to get in touch with you, how could they reach you, Josh?
I'm on the interwebs. Josh Freemire, Google search me. You'll get me on ebglaw.com. That's our website. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to track down.
And we'll have all of Josh's contact information in the show notes. Josh, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. All of today's information will be available in the show notes. If you enjoy our content, please remember to subscribe and review our podcast. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the M&A Unplugged podcast. And until then, please remember that scaling, acquiring, or selling a business takes time, preparation, and the proper knowledge.